I know we're still going to have some folks coming in from the luncheon, and I want to assure some of you that I did not plant comments in Steve Kelly's question as a lead-in to this panel, but nonetheless, it is clear that one of the principal issues that the new administration is facing right now, and we are reading about it in the paper, is exactly the title of this afternoon's panel: the impact of immigration policy on national security, whether we're talking about the border between Mexico and the United States, or Canada and the United States, or our overall integration of those who want to come into this country and become part of our country. And this afternoon, we're delighted to have a panel, and my colleague, Professor Dave Schanzer, who is an associate professor of public policy, of the practice of public policy at the Terry Sanford Institute across the way. He is also an adjunct professor at the University of North Carolina. He is integrally involved in this. And of course, before he came to Duke, he was counsel to the Homeland Security Committee and gave birth, or was part of the giving birth of the Homeland Security Department. So it's really a pleasure to turn the podium over now to Professor Dave Schanzer. David?
Thank you, Scott, and thank you as always for organizing and running a splendid conference that not only brings together so many experts in the panel for us to interact with, but also the logistics, the food. It always runs so smoothly. You're daunted from ever trying to do another event here at Duke because in comparison, you know it will fall short. So thank you for including me. Scott, one thing you haven't gotten the memo, the new word about the Sanford Institute is we're calling it the Sanford Soon-to-Be School Institute of Public Policy, because we will become Duke's newest graduate school in public policy and government next fall. So that's something to look forward to, and we'll be celebrating that actually next year. When Scott asked me to come up with a title for our panel, of course I quickly came up with the idea, so we're going to talk about immigration, national security, which is of course very direct and to the point. But I think when you talk about the words national security in other contexts, you think directly about external threats to the United States. And you spoke about them this morning, whether it be Afghanistan or Iraq, or the issue of nuclear proliferation, or even drug violence from South America spilling over into the United States. So we're talking mostly about an external threat and how it impacts the U.S. I think when we deal with this issue of immigration and national security, you need to have a much broader frame. You need to give the word national security a somewhat of a broader concept. Of course, the first concept is the classic concept, because immigration does serve as a layer of protection. Our immigration policies are designed to protect us in some degree from external threats, but it also affects our national security in many other ways. I just want to frame this issue a little bit before introducing the panel. The second way immigration and national security are so directly linked is because immigration and immigration policy affects our economic competitiveness, our trade, our ability to integrate with the world on an economic basis. And of course, our economic strength is a huge source of our national security. And indeed, Admiral Blair, in his recent testimony to Congress, made just that point, is that the economic downturn and the potential blaming of America for what has happened has an impact on our national security. The third way, of course, our immigration affects our diplomatic relations with other countries, whether it's our closest neighbors, Mexico and Canada, or others across the world, whether it be the issue of remittances of people who are in the United States to other countries and the effect that affects their economies. Immigration affects our ability to achieve our diplomatic ends in those countries. A fourth way in immigration affects our ability to project soft power, because our immigration policies reflect very much on our values. It reflects also in how we have foreign visitors, whether they be here for business, for education, for students, or just as tourists or foreign workers, how they experience the United States, and then what they do when they go back to their home countries affects very much the image of the United States, and thus the image affects our ability to project soft power, and our ability to project soft power affects both what I just talked about, our diplomacy, and our hard power as well. And of course, in a domestic context, immigration affects what happens here in the United States when our policies are either abused or taken advantage of by criminal elements, possibly even terrorists, and so that's affecting us in a classic domestic security context. And final point is that our immigration is affected or links to national security in the 12 million approximately undocumented workers that we have in the United States. And of course, most of them are here to live and work, and to the extent that affects our social fabric and our economics inside the United States, that's really an issue for some other panel somewhere else. But the presence of 12 million undocumented people can have a link to our national security in that there's a creation of a culture of non-identified people who are living in the shadows to some degree. And to the extent that exists, other people who are not just here to live and work, but for nefarious purposes, can take advantage of those type parts of our culture to affect our national security. So immigration and national security are linked on many multiple levels, both global, domestic, international, and it's a critical, important issue to talk about. And of course, there are trade-offs. When we discuss these issues, it's not like we can do something that will just increase one aspect of our national security. We can say that there's a net benefit automatically, but lots of things that we do to tighten the borders can negatively affect us in terms of our soft power or our economic or trade. And I think anybody who says the only people who are totally wrong about immigration are the ones who say that it's a simple problem, because trade-offs are implicit throughout the entire debate about national security. And fortunately, we have three speakers this afternoon who can help us untangle these issues and illuminate us as to what we've done well in the past and what we need to do in the future. Unfortunately, one of our speakers has taken ill, but I'm very pleased to announce that Duke's own Steve Kelly is going to be able to replace him, so that's why there's a change in their program. I'm going to introduce all three of our speakers now and then let them give their presentations and leave ample time for discussion. Our first is Edward Alden, and Ted is the Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the former Washington bureau chief for the Financial Times. He's the author of The Closing of the American Border, Terrorism, Immigration, and Security Since 9/11, and that's a fine book. So let me introduce the title, and available on Amazon, The Closing of the American Border, Terrorism, Immigration, and Security Since 9/11. His expertise on immigration, visa policies, U.S. trade, the impact of homeland security policies on economic competitiveness. He holds a master's in international relations from University of California, Berkeley, a bachelor's degree from the University of British Columbia. Our second panelist is Jessica Vaughan. She's a senior policy analyst for the Center of Immigration Studies, which is a Washington, D.C.-based research institute. She's been there since 1992. And her areas of expertise are visa programs, immigration benefits, immigration law enforcement. She's testified before Congress and numerous state legislatures on a range of immigration enforcement and other issues. Prior to joining the center, Ms. Vaughan was a Foreign Service officer, so she has something in common with our third speaker, at the State Department. She served as a consular and administrative post in U.S. embassies overseas. And she has a master's from Georgetown in government and a bachelor's from Washington College in Maryland. Stephen Kelly, who I just mentioned, is our diplomat in residence here at Duke and has been in the Foreign Service since 1982. He served as the Deputy Chief of Mission in both Mexico City and in Ottawa. He's teaching courses here on North American issues. I'm certain he has degrees from some esteemed institutions, but I didn't get that in time for the introduction. So we're very lucky to have them, and please welcome our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that excellent introduction, both to the substance of what we're going to deal with, and I also appreciate the plug for my book. The Amazon is a mixed blessing, as any of those of you who've written a book know. You get a constant hourly reminder of how you rate. So I'm counting on you all to help me out, so my self-esteem will improve and my numbers will rise. It's a good thing in some ways, but a depressing thing in others. It's rather extraordinary, I think, to be having a discussion of immigration policy at a national security conference like this. I studied national security as a grad student at Berkeley in the late 80s and early 90s. I got a master's, never quite finished the PhD, which is why it took so long. And we certainly never talked about immigration. I mean, the closest we ever came was discussions about the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which predicated freer trade with the Soviet Union on them allowing free emigration. It wasn't an immigration issue as such. And that's not because immigration and border security were not big issues at the time. Illegal immigration was seen as a huge problem in the 1970s and early 80s, leading up to the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. For some time in the mid-1990s, it really became one of the top national issues with the passage of Proposition 187 in California and the fear in a number of the border states that the costs of illegal immigration were becoming extraordinary. So it's a huge issue. Drug smuggling, similarly, has been a major issue on the national agenda since the late 70s, early 80s. But these were never seen as national security issues. They were considered to be important issues, but not issues vital to our national security. The national security world that I studied was focused on the big issues of grand strategy, military capabilities, nuclear deterrence, alliances and the effectiveness of our diplomacy, regional wars and their consequences, that whole set of issues. So what has changed that we're talking about immigration in this context? The short answer, of course, is September 11th. There had been a few voices in the wilderness in the 1990s, like the authors of the Hart-Rudman Commission, who had warned that a terrorist attack on the U.S. homeland was imminent, that it was a serious threat to U.S. national security, and that we simply weren't prepared either to head it off or to deal with the consequences if it happened. Of course, in retrospect, that came to look very prescient. At the time, they were largely ignored. In the wake of 9/11, however, immigration quite rightly came to be seen as a national security issue, if for no other reason than that all 19 of the terrorists had come to the United States from abroad. They were not homegrown. They came here, traveled here initially, anyway, legally, to the United States, though some, in fact, overstayed their visas. But figuring out how to stop future terrorists from getting into the United States rightly became a central security concern. Indeed, was and has been the primary mission of the new Department of Homeland Security. In advance of this, David posed a number of questions to the panelists here that I want to turn to and try to address in turn. The first was how well, what are the biggest threats that can be addressed by our immigration policies, the biggest security threats that can be addressed by our immigration policies, and how well have we used those policies to safeguard our national security? I mean, to jump ahead a bit to the conclusion, my answer is that under the very difficult circumstances that existed after 9/11, we did a reasonably good job, but that we also made some pretty big mistakes. My worry going forward is that increasingly we are embracing the notion that tougher border enforcement and tougher immigration enforcement in and of themselves necessarily enhance our national security. They don't, and indeed sometimes they can do the opposite. The good news of the past 8 years is that it's a lot tougher for a terrorist to get into the United States than it was before 9/11. The bad news is that it's also a lot harder for everyone else, and we pay a price for that. So let me turn to each of these. What are the most serious national security threats emanating from or affected by our immigration and border security policies? I mean, clearly, the threat of another terrorist attack has to be at the top of that list. And using our border powers effectively is a key part of addressing that threat. An awful lot of my book is about how we failed to do that before 9/11. The laxness in our visa policies, widespread passport fraud, poor coordination within the administration on terrorist watch lists and other tools that might have helped us to identify terrorists coming to the United States. The 9/11 Commission report, particularly the staff report on terrorist travel, does a wonderful dissecting of the mistakes that happened before 9/11. But let me read you a quote. It's from Gordon England, the former Deputy Defense Secretary, who was also the Deputy in the Department of Homeland Security. He said, this was a quote from 2007, he said, "The greatest long-term threat to U.S. national security is not terrorists wielding a nuclear or biological weapon, but the erosion of America's place as a world leader in science and technology." This is the point that David raised at the outside. What England understands is that in terms of U.S. security, letting good people in, those who contribute to the American economy, those who have helped build our scientific and technological base, and I would add more generally the millions of other immigrants who have helped to build our economy, that this is just as important as keeping out people who would do us harm. And the key is to figure out how you can do both. And I could cite a lot of statistics on the importance, particularly bringing talented immigrants to the United States. I mean, foreign students right now earn 40% of the science and engineering PhDs in the United States, and 65% of the computer science PhDs. You could say that's an indictment of our own high school educational system, and I think it is in some respects, but in the short run, we are obviously tremendously dependent on these individuals. 40% of the patents that Intel issues in any given year are for work done by immigrant software engineers. 1 in 4 of the technology companies launched in Silicon Valley in the last decade were started up by immigrant entrepreneurs. You could add to that the importance of trade. When we're talking about borders, we've got our largest trading partner, our third largest trading partner on our land borders in Canada and Mexico. The importance of foreign investment in the United States, which has been prior to this recession, growing fairly steadily. They all lead to the same conclusion, that America's economic prowess, which is the foundation of its military strength, depends heavily on openness and exchange with the rest of the world. And finally, you could add in, as David mentioned at the outset, a whole series of soft power dimensions. The way we treat people at our borders is extremely important to the U.S. image in the world. I know I saw Keith Reinhardt here earlier, and he's going to speak tomorrow. But he's constantly dealing with this question of the U.S. standing in the world, our public image. If you look at how most individuals, particularly better off individuals around the world who are most likely to be in influential positions in business and government, what's their contact with the U.S.? Well, it's through a consular officer who stamps their visa, or the border inspector who they see at the airport or the land border if they come in. That's the only contact most foreigners ever have with the U.S. government. And if you look at survey data and focus groups that have been done, they don't think they're being treated very well. And that hurts us substantially at a fundamental level. So to turn to David's second question, what steps have been taken in terms of immigration and national security, and how effective have they been? This is a big question, and there are a number of chapters in my book trying to address this question. And it's also one I think that Stuart Baker, I don't know if he's here yet today, but it's one that Stuart Baker, I'm certain, is going to address in his remarks tomorrow. So I'll skirt over a little bit. On the positive side, there are two concepts that were developed after 9/11. Various ways they predated 9/11, but they really came to fruition afterwards, that I think were very positive concepts for trying to deal with this problem of how do you simultaneously improve your border enforcement in order to keep out people who mean to do serious harm to the United States, but also let in those people that we want to let in. And those concepts were smart borders, and Steve Kelly, who's now on the panel and who I was going to acknowledge in the audience, was one of the architects of this. He was the Deputy Chief of Mission in Canada at the time of the negotiation of the Smart Border Accord. Smart borders and risk management. The idea behind smart borders was that you would use information technology, intelligence, and other tools to try to weed out and inspect higher risk traffic coming across the border. Given the enormous volume of both commercial and personal traffic into the United States, the smart border concept went, you could not possibly inspect at any level of detail everybody and everything coming across the borders. I mean, in fact, we tried that right after 9/11. The immediate response within hours of the attacks was to go to what was called a level 1 alert at the borders. And you had lineups of trucks at the bridge crossings from Ontario in the United States backing up 12, 15, 20 hours into the streets of Windsor. They had to bring out fire trucks with hoses to spray over shipments of live cattle that were waiting in the lines. And that was simply to do a thorough inspection on every vehicle coming into the United States. That was the consequence. So the idea of smart borders was that you would try to separate out the known trusted travelers, those who cross the border all the time, from travelers that you did not know as well, or you had some particular reason to believe could be a concern. And that way deal with both halves of the security equation, the enforcement protection side and the facilitation side. There were a whole series of initiatives that came out of this way of looking at the problem, and they really have substantially and dramatically transformed what it means to come into the United States if you're coming in from abroad. I'll just touch on a couple of them. I mean, advanced passenger information. Before 9/11, we had an informal, voluntary system in which some U.S. airlines would turn over basic data on their passengers to the U.S. Customs Service, primarily for reasons of drug targeting. We were trying to identify people who we thought might be drug smugglers so we could pull them aside into secondary inspection at the airport. Post 9/11, this system has been made mandatory and expanded dramatically for anybody flying into the United States on any airline from anywhere in the world. Most recently, earlier this year with Europe, we created something called, it's ESTA, I'm going to get the acronym wrong, it's an electronic advanced passenger information system, so that if you're coming from Europe, the US government needs to have data on you 2 days in advance of your flying. That doesn't mean every time you fly you have to give it to them 2 days in advance. You do it once and that's good for a couple of years. But we have fairly detailed information on everybody flying on planes from Europe into the United States. And the purpose of that is to run checks against our terrorist watch lists, use the kind of algorithms in a different context that we talked about in the first panel this morning, to try to say these are people that we need to be concerned about. We should pull this person aside when they arrive at the airport, ask them a bunch of questions, make sure it's okay to let them into the United States. Fast lanes for cargo from known shippers. We've done a lot of things to try to make it easier for shipments from big companies that we know are trustworthy, that have implemented secure systems so that we know their containers are not being used to smuggle terrorist weapons and other things across, to make it easy for them to get across the borders, again, so we can inspect the less known, higher risk cargo. Secure passports. Fraudulent passports were a huge problem before 9/11. I mean, in Belgium, you could get them in the post office, and if you managed to break into the post office, you'd get a sheaf of blank passports, and we discovered those in Afghanistan after the invasion. So we've done a lot to pressure our allies and on our own to improve the security of passports so that we know that people who are coming to the United States are who they say they are. The expansion of terrorist watch lists. There are problems with these, but the intention is a good one, which is to have a targeted tool that says, you know, this is an individual we need to be concerned about, as opposed to simply inspecting everybody with the same level of scrutiny. The whole idea was to target, so that you had a better chance of identifying the bad guys without disrupting the good guys. A second notion that Admiral Loy, who was Ridge's deputy in the Department of Homeland Security, and others tried to develop was the concept of risk management, which is basically just the old John Lewis Gaddis notion of strategy, which is that you need to match ends to means. The United States is a huge, open country, and we cannot hope to identify and keep out everyone who might do us harm. So we need to focus our efforts on the most serious threats, the biggest vulnerabilities. And that means particularly trying to identify and stop suicidal terrorists of the 9/11 hijacker variety who have showed the kind of damage that they can do. Overall, these were pretty good concepts for trying to think about how to use border and immigration policies to improve national security, to improve it on the enforcement side without damaging it on the facilitation side. The problem, and I know Stuart Baker disagrees with me on this, and you'll hear a different version tomorrow, is that this way of thinking about our borders has not prevailed. I think it's a concept that's losing. Instead, and this speaks to the final question that David posed to us, which is challenges ahead for the new administration, I'm afraid that we are moving in the direction of borders, to be slightly crude about it, that are dumber rather than smarter. A dumber border is one where rather than targeting the most serious threats, we are simply trying to build more hurdles and obstacles in the hope that we will keep everything that we're worried about out of the country. We saw a certain amount of this after 9/11, and I tell a lot of these stories in my book. You know, for instance, we crudely decided that we were going to do sweeping background checks on every male coming into the United States from a Muslim country, and that after they were here, they were going to have to register specially with the government. If they failed to do so, we were going to arrest them and send them out of the country and bar them from the country for years and years. The 9/11 Commission investigated this, found no evidence that these programs helped us to identify or keep out terrorists. And yet there were an awful lot, and I tell these stories in my book, an awful lot of doctors and engineers and scientists and others who faced 6-month, 9-month, year-long delays trying to get visas to come into the United States. I mean, one of the real ironies was that it was Indians and Chinese and Russians and others who got caught up in this, countries which are not, whatever our security concerns may be, are not seen as a terrorist threat. This is continuing to this day. We have Indian and Chinese engineers who are working for American companies on H-1B visas and other visas, who've been here for years, and who have gone back home for a personal reason. They have a family member gets married or a parent dies for some reason, they go back home. At that point, we do a detailed security background check on them. And I've been in contact with hundreds of these people who've been waiting 3, 4, 5 months in China and India to get their visas to come back to the United States. We didn't do the background checks on these people when they took jobs with US companies and they've been living here for a year. We do the background checks after they leave the country and try to come back. So it doesn't make any sense from an economic perspective, because their companies, US companies, are hurting, and it doesn't make any sense from a security perspective. It is encouraging to note that this is one of the issues that the Obama administration is starting to review. They've launched an internal review of this process, which is known as the Security Advisory Opinion process. And then, of course, we see what's going on at the southern border. President Obama's in Mexico today, so this is obviously pretty topical. We have substantially increased our resources at that border. The Border Patrol presence roughly doubled in the last 3 years. We're building miles of fencing. We're close to about 600 miles of fence now. The idea behind this, and clearly there was a need for enhanced enforcement on that border for all sorts of reasons, but the ambition here is that we are going to achieve something like operational control of that border that will allow us not only to be certain that terrorists aren't coming across the Mexican border, even though in the level of threats, and I'm sorry Bob Lyken's not here because he's done some very good analysis on this, that's pretty far down the list. We don't know of any terrorist attacks carried out by people coming through Mexico. We have efforts that have come from Canada in contrast. So that this border is one that will keep out not only terrorists, but also drug smugglers and illegal migrants. The success of that effort, judging by what's happening on the borders today, is highly questionable, to say the least. Illegal border crossings only started to fall dramatically when the recession hit in the United States. And our drug enforcement efforts, while they've raised the street cost of drugs in the United States, have enriched criminal cartels who are wreaking havoc on the Mexican side of the border and could potentially pose a genuine security threat to the United States. None of this is to argue against the utility of enforcement, but to harken back to Congressman Price's comments earlier. The drug problems, the illegal immigration problems, are ones that have to be seen in a much broader context. Border enforcement is one tool, it's part of the solution, but it's only a small part of the solution. And if we lean too heavily on it, as I believe we have been, we can end up making the problems worse rather than better. And again, on that front, I'm encouraged by this administration. You saw Secretary Clinton's comments when she was in Mexico about our responsibility in terms of our demand for drugs. You have President Obama putting comprehensive immigration reform back on the agenda, unless we can reduce the flow of illegal immigrants coming here to work by both making our legal immigration system more responsive to demand and also enforcing at the workplace so that companies are not hiring unauthorized immigrants. You're never going to get a hold of this problem just with border enforcement tools. So I will stop there, and thank you, David, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you. Jessica.
Thank you, and good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do in my remarks this afternoon is to describe what would seem to be the two most serious threats to our country that relate to border security and to our immigration policy, and then to describe what I see as some of the still very grave vulnerabilities that exist in the system today that leave us exposed to these threats. I would agree that prior to 9/11, most of the agencies and indeed the opinion leaders and political leaders in our country did not understand the potential for having for losing control of our borders and of our immigration system, and the 9/11 attacks can be viewed as kind of the worst case scenario of what happens when we don't have the kind of controls that we should have. And I, for the record, do believe that we've made quite a lot of progress since September 11, 2001. But I do think that, and this afternoon I am going to focus on what I think are still some of the gaps that remain, and then finally make a few recommendations for how to close those gaps. The first threat that results from first threat to national security that results from failing to control our borders, of course, is international terrorism. And I do want to continue to use that term terrorism, despite what Secretary Napolitano has adopted as a new way of talking about terrorism. She calls them man-caused disaster, which to me sounds a little bit like what happens when my husband changes the oil in the driveway. So I was encouraged to see today that people are still using the term terrorism. Since 9/11, our federal agencies have prevented at least 22 attacks. So we have been doing something right since then, and some of the things that some of the precautions that we're taking and the policies we've adopted are paying off. However, terrorist organizations are still out there. They're still recruiting. They're still training. They're still pulling in revenue to support their objectives. And in the past, we know that they have studied our immigration system to discover what the vulnerabilities are and the ways that they can exploit those or take advantage of those to enter the country to harm Americans and the United States for political reasons. And most of this threat is still from overseas, so of course border security and our immigration policy are going to play a role in preventing the entry of terrorists to do that. The other major national security threat, which is also often talked about in terms of a public safety threat, is the activity of foreign drug trafficking organizations, primarily the Mexican drug trafficking organizations. Now, these drug cartels have been around for 35 years or so, but it's only recently that they are much more of a problem for us as a nation. And there are a few reasons for that, and I'm just going to spend a little bit more time on that because that's been the focus of some of my research and writing recently, and I did have traveled down to Ciudad Juarez and El Paso and interviewed a number of US government officials and private individuals about it. This is the first time, even though they've been around for a while, this is the first time that the Mexican government, to its credit, is actually confronting these organizations rather than tolerating or even managing their existence. And so there is a challenge to their operations and to the control that they have been able to have historically in Mexico. For the United States, I think recently, and specifically in this administration, has sought to characterize this as Mexico's problem that we are helping them with. But I very firmly believe that this is, in fact, our problem right now. And the reason for that is one reason for that is because beyond this, just the breakdown of the rule of law or absence of the rule of law in many parts of Mexico, the drug trafficking organizations, for a variety of reasons, have now established very formal partnerships with U.S. gangs on this side, many of which are made up largely of immigrants or the children of immigrants, both members of prison gangs and street gangs. And these U.S.-based criminal organizations are managing the distribution networks. They are carrying out disciplinary action and collecting money for the leaders back in Mexico. These criminal organizations are extremely well armed. This business is so lucrative that they have been able to arm themselves and equip themselves and put themselves now in a position where they can confront and even attack U.S. law enforcement agencies, and in fact have shown a great willingness to do that. In Arizona, they've seized, in addition to drugs and cash sometimes, but also vehicles and high-powered weaponry, uniforms that are exact copies of, if not actual examples of what is worn by U.S. law enforcement agencies. And this material is used to intimidate others, to carry out their business, to disguise themselves, and what have you. And both the state and federal law enforcement agencies that I've spoken with about it are extremely concerned about what they perceive as a new and increased willingness to use violence for the purposes of intimidation, and they have now an unprecedented level of organization, of technology at their disposal, and of training that they've been able to achieve really a new level of brutality and intimidation than ever before. And as I said, they're quite unnerved by this, and quite unnerved by the attacks that have already occurred on U.S. soil. Not just in the border states, but also in places like Columbus, Ohio, which is now a center for heroin distribution, Atlanta. Even here in North Carolina, ISIS arrested more than 300 foreign-born gang members. And many of these have direct connections to the Mexican drug cartels. So that's the other, I think, serious problem that we're going to have to use immigration policy and immigration law authorities to address very carefully. And I think the reason that we are so vulnerable is because for too many years we did not effectively gain control of who's coming into the country and prevent enough people, ineligible visitors, from coming in. So what are the ineligibilities? And I'm going to talk about them just organize my remarks in the context of the specific agencies that are responsible for the various layers of defense that we have. I'll start off with the State Department and its consular officers, who are often talked about as the first line of defense that we have. The main problem I see here and have observed and experienced myself is that the State Department, rather than approaching the visa issuance process as a national security issue or even as an immigration issue, really approaches it as a management problem, as a workload problem that needs to be handled. And in addition, they have an institutional predisposition to emphasize the facilitation of travel rather than interdicting terrorists or preventing people from arriving in the United States who are either ineligible or mean us harm. And I think it's improved a lot since 9/11. The training has improved. The screening tools have improved greatly. But I detect still in the leadership and supervisory positions there that they are still very, very susceptible to pressure from those special interest groups that benefit from very loose controls, and also a predisposition toward visa issuances rather than visa denials. And the result is that translates into many, many, many visa issuances a year, which has, is part of what they do. We're now up to about 6.6 million visa issuances every year, which translates into about 30 million entries. And more striking even than the overall number of people arriving at in our country is the approval rates for it. It is not, contrary to the impression many people have, it's not all that hard to get a visa to come to the United States. The approval rate is 89% for Mexicans, 94% for Saudi Arabians, 60% for Pakistanis, and even 68% approval rate for people coming from Nigeria. And the result is that there are many, many people who are getting visas who shouldn't have gotten them, such as the 9/11 hijackers, and even today, just people being issued visas who don't qualify for a variety of reasons. And as I said, I think there have been a lot of improvements since 9/11, but the other problem is that there is no quality control to speak of. Because we don't have an exit system in place to let us know who is abusing the terms of their visa and overstaying, there's no feedback that consular officers get as to the mistakes that they made. Who was a mistake? Because of course, it's not enough to say simply, we're just letting too many people in, we've got to cut it back by 20%, and that will be a security enhancement. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You need to know which ones not to issue. And a good clue to that would be looking at who has overstayed and what countries, maybe Pakistanis are not a problem, but Malaysians are a problem. I mean, the problem is we have no information on that at this point in time. Moving on to the other form of Border Patrol, many of those who don't qualify for a visa are now, will try to enter over the land borders. And we've got 2,000 miles of a southern border and 4,000 miles of a northern border. Again, we have made huge progress on this front, not only because of staffing increases, but also due to infrastructure improvements and uses of technology, especially the fence that's been put up. In the El Paso sector, back in the 1990s, they were apprehending something like 1,000 illegal aliens a day trying to cross the land border. As of February, it's down to 38 people a day. This is a huge difference that is just was almost unimaginable in the 1990s. And while fencing itself is not a solution for everywhere, it is a real, there are very good legitimate operational reasons for having it, especially in the population areas, and has made a huge difference. Now the gaps are still in places like Arizona, which is where most of the traffic has been funneled, as we have gained operational control both in Texas and in California. With us gaining control of the land border, this places much more pressure on the formal ports of entry. And there are, in El Paso again, for example, just to use that as an example because that's where I've been recently, every day there are 100,000 people who cross the 4 bridges over the Rio Grande to enter the United States, and 40,000 vehicles. That's a huge number of people to try to process with any kind of confidence that we're actually focusing on the right people and stopping the people who shouldn't be entering. The numbers are just overwhelming. And again, we have made some huge improvements, particularly with the approval of a law in 2004 that requires people who are claiming to be U.S. citizens to actually present the kind of travel document that enables us to know with confidence that they are actually U.S. citizens. That's the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative that will finally go into effect 5 years later this summer. The problem is that we still really take no steps to verify the identity of the 9 million individuals who use border crossing cards to enter the United States from Mexico. The State Department's issued about 9 million of these documents over the last 10 years. And while the documents have security features, including biometrics, the border inspectors do not actually use those features to verify the identity of the people who are coming in from Mexico. And so one of the biggest problems for Customs and Border Protection is this problem of imposters using border crossing cards. Anybody who has between $50 and $500 can go visit one of the asesoría migratorias in Juarez, for example, and they will flip through a loose leaf binder of border crossing cards that have been lost, stolen, or sold, and there are probably 10,000 of them on the market. They'll pick out one that matches your hair color and your general appearance, and you can use it to walk across the border. Many of them are detected. I am a strong believer in the value of well-trained officers who can make good judgments about who should be allowed in. But thousands of them are not detected either. So that right now, especially given the public safety threat of the drug trafficking organizations, is a major vulnerability that we should make a priority to address. And I don't see that focus at all coming from the current administration, at least not that they have discussed publicly, that everything's focused on southbound, not much on who we're actually letting in still. The job of cleaning up after all these three other agencies that I mentioned falls on the Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. The good news is that despite all of these vulnerabilities, our immigration law does provide very effective tools to enable ICE agents to disrupt the activity of either terrorists or criminal aliens, to take them off the street if they don't have lawful status, to investigate their activities and to prosecute them, and also ultimately to dismantle terrorist organizations or drug trafficking organizations, whomever is a problem, and detain these individuals and ultimately remove them from our country. And as a standalone law enforcement organization, they're in a much, much better position to do that now in 2009 than they were as the previous organization, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And it was indeed a great innovation and improvement to separate the enforcement function from the other function of providing immigration benefits. And they are much better able now as a law enforcement agency to plan their investigations strategically and develop priorities centrally at headquarters rather than spread out across the country in the various field offices. The problem still with ICE is that they do not have nearly enough resources to keep up with the various missions that they have and the problems that we face. They're woefully outnumbered. And the biggest help that we could give them, one tremendous resource for them, is state and local law enforcement agencies around the country who are most likely to be the first responders to either a terrorist act or, they're the ones most likely to encounter someone who means us harm or is a threat to public safety. One serious problem is that many local leaders, for political reasons, have sought to discourage or in some few cases outright forbid local law enforcement agencies from cooperating with ICE. And this is a big problem for us and a big problem for ICE. So it's very important that we work hard to facilitate this cooperation and make sure that it's done appropriately. And not overreaching the authority of the state and local law enforcement agencies. But that is a huge force multiplier for ICE and one that needs to be taken advantage of. Finally, I would just say our legal immigration system, the immigration benefit system, tolerates just far too much fraud in the system, that people who are not qualified to gain immigration benefits, whether they're green cards or temporary visas or whatever, are able to do that. And we need to direct more resources into doing our best to eliminate the fraud in the process. Most of this is a result of the huge numbers of applications. So I think USCIS processes like 30,000 applications a day for immigration benefits, so they don't have time to screen everyone appropriately. And I'll just close by saying that there's been a tendency in recent years to try to de-link immigration policy from national security policy and concerns, in reaction to the fact that I believe that it's a reaction because many of the improvements that have been made under the auspices of national security have also interfered with the flow of workers that certain special interests had become accustomed to having access to. And this delinking, even though there still are legitimate national security reasons for these improvements, and I think that's very problematic for us as a nation, I believe firmly that if we have a system, an immigration system that has integrity and that and we have immigration law enforcement that is carried on a routine basis across the board and sustained over a period of time, that routine immigration law enforcement not only will bring integrity to the system, but also stop the bad guys that we want to stop. That's rather than trying to surgically identify needles in the haystack, what we need to do is shrink the size of the haystack so that our law enforcement agencies can devote appropriate attention to the cases that concern us or threaten us the most.
Thank you. Great. Steve.
I'm happy to step in at the last minute. One thing they teach us in the Foreign Service is to be prepared to think on your feet and adapt to changed circumstances. And since my day job here is actually recruiting for the Foreign Service, if anything I say today interests you, please come see me. I'm the recruiter here at Duke for the State Department. And as for degrees, I do have a master's in national security studies from the National War College. So that's one thing that's sort of relevant to this discussion. Like Congressman Price, I have flown over the southern and northern border from coast to coast. I was Deputy Chief of Mission in Ottawa for 4 years and got to fly with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police from the Pacific Ocean inland about 50 miles in Vancouver. I was Consul General in Quebec City for 3 years in the 90s and have seen every inch of the border from Calais, Maine to Montreal. And on the southern border, I've flown with the Border Patrol inland from San Diego to see that portion of the border. I've flown over the Sonoran Desert like Congressman Price. And there was an incident in 2005 when somebody on the Mexican side of the border was shooting at our Border Patrol agents on the northern side of the border. And they found this guy dead and tied to a tree a few days after his picture was taken by the Border Patrol with one of their cameras. The Border Patrol had not finished him off. They think the drug cartels in that sector of the border had, because that's bad for business. The last thing drug cartels want is increased focus by U.S. law enforcement people, and this individual had attracted their attention. When I visited the border, I actually went with the Border Patrol. They have a river patrol in the lower reaches of the Rio Grande, and I went out on their boats, and they made me wear a life vest that was also bulletproof, which seems like sort of a contradiction, but they assured me that if I fell in the water, I would float. So I've seen a lot of the border. I served in Mexico, served twice in Canada, and what has struck me about this, especially in connection with immigration, is that there's a lot of misinformation and things are not as they appear. So I'd just like to take a minute or two and reflect on things that I worry that a lot of Americans don't appreciate. First of all, obviously, immigration is a very complicated issue, especially with regard to Mexico. One thing you have to appreciate is Mexicans would rather be in Mexico. Much more than Americans, family is so important in a Mexican family. I went to Querétaro in Mexico to do a week of intensive language training, and my instructor was this very nice 22-year-old Mexican woman who, in discussing the difference between Mexicans and Americans, noted that, we Americans send our kids off to college. Sometimes they go 3,000 miles away to go to college. Mexicans think we're nuts. Your kids should go to college right there. They should live at home. They get married, they come back, they live at home, they have their kids there. They're very family-oriented. So for a Mexican man to pack up, head for the border to clean toilets in Chicago or pick blueberries in Maine, this is a huge psychological trauma for them. So obviously they only do it because they're extremely desperate. Another ironic thing is that tighter border controls have led more Mexicans to come to the United States and stay here. Because once it used to be that the border was kind of fluid. In fact, for you students of immigration, prior to 1875, we had no border controls in the United States. People moved across the northern and the southern border freely. When we won depending on how you look at it. When we won Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California from Mexico in the mid-1800s, every Mexican living in the new territory automatically had the option of becoming a U.S. citizen. And even the southern border was pretty much wide open until 1920 or so. We didn't try to control immigration from the north or the south. Our immigration laws actually grew up against the Chinese and Japanese, who various people felt were stealing American jobs when they were imported by private companies to build the railroads in the western part of the United States. Something like 1 million Quebecers came across the northern border to work in New England textile and shoe factories in the early 1900s. Where was the border? They didn't check in with anybody. They didn't have visas. So we had a relatively open attitude about immigration prior to the 1920s and 1930s. Well, as we tightened up the border, it became harder to get back and forth. And where Mexicans used to come to the US for temporary worker programs, the Bracero program is the best known one. During World War II, we lacked labor in the US, so we had a program to bring Mexicans in to work in agricultural jobs and railroad jobs. That program was finally phased out in 1964, but it was still relatively easy to move back and forth across the border. And as recently as the early 2000s, at Christmas time, there'd be a big line of trucks going south with Mexicans who were returning home with their trucks loaded with refrigerators and washing machines and other things they'd bought in the US. Well, our tighter border controls now mean that when the man of the family gets to Raleigh, gets to Chicago, gets to El Paso and finds a job, rather than risk going home and not being able to get back, he tries to bring his family to join him. And so the number of minors and women who've been found on the southern border has skyrocketed as these people are discovered trying to get through the ports of entry, or worse, trying to cross the Sonoran Desert. Another thing about immigration is it's kind of like squeezing a balloon, and Jessica alluded to this as well. Indeed, it's a lot harder to get across the border in Tijuana now because we built a fence there, Operation Gatekeeper, and that moved immigration to the Sonoran Desert, which is extremely inhospitable. And in 2005, more than 450 immigrants died trying to cross the desert because it's extremely hot in the summer, and frankly, in the winter, a number of them die of exposure as well. So that has forced immigrants to move to the center of the country, or the center of the border, but it hasn't reduced the number of people trying to cross the border. And I think they still think something between 350 and 400,000 undocumented workers managed to get across the border up until the recent economic crisis, which has certainly diminished that number. I think in addition to these misconceptions, or at least better understanding about what motivates Mexicans, the Pew Center for Hispanic Studies just published a report, I think 2 days ago, that showed that something like 94% of Mexican undocumented men in the United States have jobs. So any conception that they're here to loiter, take advantage of our generous social systems and so on doesn't seem to be borne out. UNC did a study in 2006 of the situation of migrant workers, or migrants in general, here in North Carolina. And what they were trying to measure was, what's the net impact on the state? Are they a net burden to the state, or are they a net benefit? And they measured what do they pay in taxes, what do they pay in Social Security, which of course many of them will never collect because they're using an illegitimate Social Security number. What kind of impact do they have on the economy, because they also shop, and therefore there's an effect, a ballooning effect from that. Other jobs are created servicing the needs of Mexican immigrants. And then what do they cost? Their kids go to school. They use hospital services. They almost never have insurance, so there's a burden in that way. They do get arrested and they go to prison, although not at numbers that are larger than the native population. UNC concluded that there was a small net cost to the state. I think it was $81 per immigrant in North Carolina, small net cost to the state. Not exactly the same number that a lot of people would have concluded. Another thought I'd like to leave with you is that in many ways we have an historic opportunity now to get our relations with Mexico right. If you are not familiar with Mexicans and how they feel about the United States. For many of them, the Mexican-American War happened yesterday. And the fact that we took or won about half of Mexico's territory at the time, at the end of that war, still burns in their consciousness. And our relations with Mexico, frankly, haven't been that good up until 2000 when President Fox won election. The degree of suspicion on both sides of the border was fairly high. But Mexico's birth rate has been declining steadily now for almost 15 years. What we're seeing in Mexico now is a bulge in population, young people that need jobs, but that's not going to continue. Family size has decreased rather sharply. Also, the economy in Mexico has improved. Now, they're going through the same problems we are now with the recession, and since they send us 80% of their exports and our market has shrunk, this is certainly going to hurt them. But the Mexican economy is much healthier than it was 20 years ago, in large part because of NAFTA, which is another controversial topic, but I don't think anybody would disagree that the volume of trade has gone up, the volume of investment in Mexico has gone up. So if you were a Mexican and you'd prefer to stay in Mexico and you could find a job in Mexico that paid a living wage, odds are you'd stay in Mexico. And also, perhaps the most important change now, and this gets back to the immigration and security debate, is that President Calderon, who was elected in 2006, has made good relations with the United States, has made a partnership with the United States his absolute top priority. When I was in Mexico, I left in 2006 before he was elected. The Mexican Army just wouldn't talk to us. We had very frosty relations with the Mexican Army. Corruption is endemic in Mexico, especially in local police forces. So our partners in the fight against drug crime cannot and usually aren't the local police forces because the cartels own them. The military is the only tool that President Calderon really has to combat drug cartels. And they wouldn't talk to us prior to 2006. One good thing that happened, not for us, but for relations with the Mexican military, was Hurricane Katrina. Because Mexico was one of the first countries to offer assistance to the United States after Katrina hit New Orleans. And indeed, I was chargé at the time, and I got a call from the foreign ministry saying, we want to send a convoy of Army trucks to the United States to help feed people who've been displaced by the hurricane. And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. Do they have visas? Do they have passports? You might expect. And ever since then, our relationship with the Mexican military, the Army in particular, has increased tremendously. I mention all this because the only way we're going to secure our own borders, whether it's from drug cartels or an immigration threat, is if we work with our neighbors. We have great working relations with Canada already. We've been sitting in Colorado Springs, Colorado at NORAD headquarters with the Canadians since 1958 in NORAD. We don't have anything like that with Mexico, but we're on the verge of creating something like that. Immigration is so important to the Mexican government. President Fox made immigration reform a key part of his mandate, and of course he failed because President Bush was unable to get a comprehensive immigration bill passed through Congress. Congressman Price mentioned today some of the reasons Mexico is important to us. Its third largest trading partner. In 2007, Canada was our #1 oil supplier, and Mexico was #2. Obviously, Mexico is our largest supplier of illegal drugs and immigrants. It's our neighbor. We don't really know that much about it, but we have an opportunity to set relations right. And therefore, we have to do something about immigration, not just for our own good, but to preserve this relationship. Because as I said, we can't control our southern border without cooperation from the other side. It's intelligence sharing. It's the smart border concepts that Ted was talking about. Wouldn't it be better if we knew something about the threat that was coming at us from the southern border than to discover that poor CBP inspector working on the border, all those trucks, all the things that Jessica talked about are true. The volume of traffic. San Ysidro in Southern California is the busiest border crossing in the world. 250,000 people cross that border every day. You're never going to control every one of those people, but if we had better cooperation with the Mexicans, we could do this together. If we use technology in a more intelligent way, we could do this better. If we shared intelligence, and by the way, the Mexicans share a lot of intelligence about incoming flights to Mexico that aren't even going on to the United States. Our cooperation with Mexico is tremendous on the terrorism score, because the Mexicans of all people know that if a terrorist attack in the United States was ever launched from Mexico, it would be a disaster for Mexico, that we would shut the border down, we would take measures that would strangle them and their trade. So nobody is more attentive to our concerns about terrorism than the Mexican government. So that's just a little different spin on the issue of immigration and how Mexico in particular figures into it. And I think that, you know, greater cooperation with Mexico is not only good for our security, but given the fact that Hispanics now make up the largest minority group in the United States, I think it's also good politics.
Thank you, Steve, for filling in with a really terrific talk. I think it is important to make one point, which is the rumors fly around about the plans of the Obama administration, I think lots of false ones, and since there was a reference to the Mexican-American War, I think it's important to point out there is no proposal now to give Texas back. Is that correct?
I would make that proposal, though.
No. Now, we don't want to get in trouble there, but I want to give the panelists a chance to make any points in response to what they heard, but I also, Congressman Price, did you want to ask our panelists a question before you have to depart, or?
I've enjoyed it. I am due somewhere else. So.
Okay, sorry. Well, we have half an hour still. Why don't we give each panelist 2 minutes to respond, at least especially Ted and Jessica, who went as the first to something that they heard after they spoke that they wanted to comment on.
I mean, I'd love to hear, questions from the audience. I thought, Steve's comments were tremendous, and I would, with the possible exception of giving Texas back to the Mexicans, I would endorse everything thing that he said. I think the real issue between Jessica and myself on this is the question of what costs are we prepared to pay to secure our borders. I mean, she is arguing that the volumes are overwhelming and that the only way we get to where we want to be is by shrinking the haystack dramatically. That means fewer people coming in on visas, fewer immigrants coming in, both legal and illegal, and vastly increased resources for the, not just the legal side of the immigration bureaucracy, but the enforcement side as well. And then we hit some kind of equilibrium. Well, if you look at the numbers post 9/11, we've never recovered to pre-9/11 levels on visa or cross-border travel. Look at the numbers on the Canadian border. Cross-border travel, just to take one example of Blaine, Washington, between British Columbia and Washington State. Used to be that cross-border shopping went up and down with the value of the Canadian currency. When the Canadian currency was strong, a lot of people came down to shop in the United States. When it was weak, it slowed down, and so the numbers fell. Well, Canadian dollar 6-8 months ago hit parity with the United States. Those numbers continued to be depressed. That was a historic relationship between currency value and cross-border traffic that has been disrupted by the simple fact that it's so hard now for Canadians to get across that border crossing into the United States. So I think we have to find ways to improve our security and deal with the volumes of traffic, commercial and human, that are coming into the U.S. and that we want to come into the U.S. And that if the only way we can secure our country is dramatically lower those numbers, I think we're in big trouble. I think we have to find a way to do both, to preserve our historic openness, to build on it, but also to increase our security. I think we can do that. I don't think we have to make the kind of trade-off that Jessica's talking about.
Jessica, do you want to make a couple comments here?
Well, I don't think it makes any sense to just give in to the fact that the level of illegal immigration is as high as it is. I think that that clearly has to come down. Right now, about 30% of all the people who are coming into the country every year are coming in illegally. Legal immigration is at about 1.1 million a year right now. Illegal immigration has been at about 500,000 a year. It has decreased as a result of both, and I would argue it's more due to enforcement that we have undertaken in the last few years than it is due to the economy. And the reason I say this, we've published a study on this, is that the decline in both the new illegal arrivals and the resident, what we call the stock population of illegal aliens, was declining even before the economy went into the tank. And you can see this by monitoring the Census Bureau data on this, the monthly surveys that are done. So it's not just the economy, it's the fact that over in the last 2 years of the last administration, enforcement was much more focused and much better funded and therefore much more effective. And it's not just a matter of physical removals, of actually, apprehending an illegal alien and detaining them and then, having them be removed by an immigration judge. There are a lot more people who left on their own than were physically removed by ICE. And that is because immigration to this country, especially illegal immigration, is not a force of nature. It results from choices that human beings make to attempt it, and before recent years, the knowledge that if they could make it across that border, they were home free, and that there was very little risk of being sent back home. And I would say also it's not when you talk about reducing the numbers, it's going to be mainly in reducing the level of illegal immigration, which we simply, for national security reasons and economic reasons, cannot afford to continue. So that was the main point I wanted to make, that it is not just about the economy. The numbers have come down. Our recent efforts to enforce the law have been successful and worked, and they need to be sustained before we see much more progress. I mean, the stock population is down now from 12 million, we think, to about a little over 11 million. And if we were to keep that up, we could bring it down much further at great economic and security benefit to our nation.
Okay, unless Steve wanted to add to anything, or then we can go to questions.
I would be remiss if I didn't defend my State Department colleagues. Jessica's suggestion that the State Department is still more interested in facilitation than security. In Mexico City, which is the largest non-immigrant visa issuing post in the world, we had 2,000 people line up every morning to get visas. The refusal rate in Mexico City was 35%. But considering that 300,000 to 400,000 people can walk across the border, and in fact many more than that try, because the apprehensions are up over 1 million. So the ones the Border Patrol catches are more than 1 million. The only people that apply for visas are ones who think they have a reasonable chance, a reasonable case of getting one. It costs $100 per person to apply for a visa. And you pay the $100 whether you get the visa or not. So if you're a family of 4 and you're applying for a visa to go to Disneyland, that's $400, not including your cost of your Mexican passport, your ticket, etc. So in fact, the people who apply for visas generally meet the criteria, and the checks that the consular officers have to go through before they can issue a visa now are incredible. The databases that we work from, that we're plugged into, the name checks that they put them through, if there's any doubt, they have to come back. They have to submit fingerprints if there's any further doubt. I think since 9/11, the State Department, remember the only US government official who was fired for 9/11 was Mary Ryan, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Consular Affairs. It really was quite unfair. Indeed, the State Department had become more facilitative over the years, but that's because it was starved of resources, and there was a lot of pressure to issue visas to people who seemed low risk. The problem was, before 9/11, what we were mostly worried about was the person sneaking into the US to go flip hamburgers at McDonald's. So if you were a Saudi and you had a lot of money, you didn't meet the profile of the typical illegal immigrant. Now, with the security threat so much more evident, the consular training's been extended from 5 to 7 weeks, and it's security, security, security.
All right, I think there's a microphone around for questions, so raise your hand and there's a question right over here.
First, I'd like to thank all the panelists for being here. This is very informative. My name is Ethan Beatty. I'm an immigration attorney here locally and a dabbler in national security issues. My question kind of goes, I didn't hear a whole lot of targeting a solution for those that are here now, that have already come across the border, whether they're paper filled out and have either overstayed visas or had visas.
Jessica, you want to start, and then Ted or Steve can comment?
Sure. I think there is a solution to it, and the solution is to make better use of the laws that we have and tweak them to increase what I call voluntary compliance with immigration laws. Often the policy choices that are set out before our policymakers is either you have to go door to door and round up every single illegal alien that you can find and lock them up and then put them on a bus or a plane back to their home country. And if you're not going to do that, then what you have to do is legalize everyone. The reality and the policy that's going to be most effective is neither one of those, but to adequately fund immigration law enforcement so that we can carry out routine immigration law enforcement across the board that addresses the criminal alien population as the top priority, but also gives resources toward both workplace enforcement and voluntary compliance with immigration laws. And because while there are people whose goal in coming here illegally is to do us harm or to carry out criminal activity, for most of the people who are crossing the border, who want to come here or flying in, want to stay illegally, they are interested in working here. And so, if we could improve our workplace compliance, and we have the tools to do that, we simply have not insisted that employers use them. And I'm referring to the electronic verification known as E-Verify. If we can get that to happen, then ICE can focus its resources on the most egregious employers and also on the organized crime and other problems that we have that are appropriately addressed by law enforcement agencies. So the idea is to get more people to do it on their own, rather than to have to impose it by force. We call it attrition through enforcement.
I mean, one of the problems with this debate that I see constantly is that it's very difficult to think clearly about the security side and the immigration enforcement side and where they intersect. I mean, from a security perspective, our biggest concern as a nation is preventing another terrorist attack of the sort that we saw on 9/11. And let's put somewhere below that dealing with high-level transnational organized crime. So those, and terrorism a lot higher than that. So that's the top of the list. So what's the biggest concern on that front? We hear a lot of talk about illegal immigration, and because we don't know anything about illegal immigrants, that's a major security vulnerability. I think it is. But the fact is that there are millions of people in this country right now working here on legal temporary visas, work visas. We've never done a proper security check on any of these people. When we do the security background check is when they apply for a green card. And in fact, there are enormous incentives in the legal system, largely because of the fee funding structure, for USCIS to delay that as long as it possibly can, because these people have to pay renewal fees every year to hold on to their temporary visas. And so from a security perspective, we've got these people who are here legally, who we know nothing about, who could well be, from a terrorism perspective, a source of concern. But we don't vet them properly unless they apply for a green card. Well, that just makes no sense from a security perspective. The question of the 11 or 12 million illegal immigrants, obviously this is a huge population that we know nothing about. I mean, from a pure security perspective, our interest is to figure something out about these people. And that would be some combination of identifying the bad ones, which is a high priority now. You heard the congressman talk about that. A lot of the enforcement efforts are aimed at people with criminal records, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And offering some normalization path for other people who've been here for a long time, who are working, who have U.S. citizen kids, who are dug in here, so that we can get them into the system and we know something about them. If your purpose is simply to crack down on illegal immigration, then that's a different question. If you think those people broke the law, they're here illegally, they're bad for Americans, we should get rid of them, that's a different problem. It's not a security question.
One of the problems, one of the tools that we could use already exists. It's 287G authority, which allows any local law enforcement body, municipal or county, to have an agreement with the Department of Justice so that when they apprehend an individual for any cause. They run a check to see if they're in the country legally or not. And it was designed, and its stated purpose was to find murderers, rapists, dangerous criminals who are here in the United States illegally and deport them. The trouble is, in effect, 90% of those who are picked up and deported it's because their taillight was out or they ran a stop sign. They haven't actually committed a crime, but they're run through the same process and deported as a result. So what that tends to do is it leads to fear in the immigrant community to talk to the police for any reason, for fear that they, in fact, would be swept up in this same process, and therefore dangerous criminals manage to hang out in immigrant communities without being turned in by other law-abiding immigrants because they're afraid to be caught up in the same mechanism.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Steve Keating from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I think they are separate issues when you look at illegal immigration merely as a violation of border security and the laws, and then nefarious activity. But the Venn diagrams do overlap, especially in the area of trafficking in persons in terms of the illegitimate and the unlawful and morally wrong sex trade that exists with regards to a lot of the Mexican workers who are here in the United States, whether legally or illegally. So we have these bleed over type of very nefarious activities, which people may not necessarily be wanting to blow up buildings, but they're destroying lives of innocent Mexican women and children in the process. And I think from the standpoint of a moral coherence that Representative Price mentioned, it is something of concern to the United States and should be examined a little bit more thoroughly. Thank you. I'd like to know if anyone, and if y'all have any comments with regards to that.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think I think these are the sort of criminal activities that you need to crack down on, and we need to cooperate with the countries that are sending these people to the United States. That's the sort of issue that Steve talked about that I think is ripe for cooperation with the Mexican government if we can get it, and other governments. So yeah, I agree.
We have an office in the State Department, GTIP, it's in the Global Bureau of Trafficking in Persons. There's actually legislation that says that if a country is identified as being a transit country or source country for trafficking in persons, that various U.S. assistance can be withheld. And Mexico's been under the gun a couple of times, mostly because they didn't have a law against trafficking. They have laws against prostitution, they have laws against kidnapping, but they didn't actually have a law against trafficking in persons. And as we discussed before, since law enforcement is not always the most is subject to other pressures, this wasn't necessarily a priority for them. So I know that the U.S. government has worked with the Mexican government to try to improve enforcement in this area. There was actually some trafficking in young girls from Eastern Europe who would be flown into Mexico and then smuggled into the United States. So the Mexican government, again, not wanting to be identified as a source of this kind of trade, has tried to tighten up.
I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to ask one question. Especially since Bob Lycan wasn't here, and we've had a kind of mostly North America focus. If you look at the possible sources of terrorist threat, there's a lot talked about homegrown terrorism, but it's a relatively very low likelihood. If you're talking about coming from high-risk countries like Saudi or Pakistan or elsewhere, we do have the consular process, and while it may not be perfect, at least that is a serious check on somebody entering the United States. But what we're seeing in terrorism trends is that probably the most potent place for especially a Muslim terrorist is from Europe, and we're talking about not necessarily people who have immigrated from another country and are living in a EU country, let's say, as an immigrant and wouldn't have a passport, but from second and third generation immigrants who are very disassociated with their society. They have not been inculcated. They don't have a national identity with that country, and those are the people who are most at risk, in essence, to becoming radicalized. Yet, if they are born in those countries and they're citizens, they would have an EU passport, and they would be eligible for something, and folks here might not know the terminology, something called the visa waiver program. This is exactly what Bob was going to talk about, which means if you're an average British citizen and you've got a passport, you don't need to go to the State Department and get a visa to come to the United States. You can just buy a ticket, get on a plane, show your passport. You get questioned and you get put into U.S. visit and fingerprinted when you come in, but the process has much less security. So I wanted our panelists, if they could, to maybe comment on what kinds of vulnerability we might face because of the visa waiver program, especially with respect to immigrant Muslims living in the EU and elsewhere. Anybody?
Do you want me to start?
Well, we'll just go right down the row, sure.
Yeah, I mean, what you're voicing there actually has been very much the DHS evaluation of it, and you'll hear this, I suspect, from Stuart Baker tomorrow. And I have no reason to think it's changed particularly with the new administration. DHS for a number of years has focused on Europe for exactly this reason. The assessment has been that the most likely source of terrorists coming to the United States would be a homegrown Islamic radical with a British passport or French passport or German passport coming in on the visa waiver program. That is the reason that the U.S. has put a lot of pressure on Europe to get all this advanced information on people coming over to the United States. I mean, the Richard Reed scenario, the guy who tried to light his shoe on fire on the transatlantic plane, that inspired efforts to make sure that the U.S. government could do security scrubs on transatlantic airline passengers before they ever got on their planes. Until the beginning of this year, we got that information, but not until after the plane had actually taken off, which if the purpose was to bring down an airliner would have been too late. So there's been a lot of focus on that in DHS, and I think the assessment is that plus putting a lot of pressure on the Europeans to improve the security of their passports, which they've done, plus intelligence cooperation with European allies, is about as far as we can go down that road unless we're going to think about eliminating the visa waiver program, and that's not the direction we're going. In fact, we've been expanding it. Where that takes you, and I guarantee you this is what Stuart will tell you tomorrow, is that Canada is probably the next biggest vulnerability, because there are immigrant communities in Canada which are fairly natural homes for a lot of radical populations. There are ways that Canadians are strenuous in denying this, but there are ways in which it's easier to get into Canada than into the United States. And we have a number of cases of terrorists attempting to use Canada as a road into the United States. The Canadians argue that, look, we're taking care of it. You know, our intelligence, our efforts on this front are every bit as good as you are. But for privacy reasons, for reasons having to do partly with the Arar case, which a lot of you probably heard about, the Canadian who was rendered to Syria and tortured, the Canadians are pretty reluctant to share certain kinds of information with the United States. And so the U.S. has somewhat less confidence in Canada than you might think they would otherwise.
Jessica and Steve, I'm sure, is going to have some comments on Canada.
Not on Canada particularly, but on the visa waiver program. I think we need to have the visa waiver program, that the benefits of having it do outweigh the very real risks of having it. I was not in favor of expanding it to the countries that were recently added to it, most of which were in Eastern Europe. Korea is one of them, which I think was a good case for inclusion in the visa waiver program. But the reason I think we need to go slow on expanding it is because we don't yet have the exit recording system in place that would allow us to know which visitors who've come in either under the visa waiver program or under the regular visa program have in fact abided by the terms of their visa and actually gone home. We did a fantastic job in implementing U.S. Visit so that we could authenticate the identity of people who come in and screen them at the time. And just by the way, currently people who are screened for non-immigrant visas are getting the same kind of screening as people for green cards. I mean, that's something that's been gradually implemented. So they are being screened. But screening is not always enough, but it is a precaution we have to take. But so exit now really is the key to being able to sustain these programs that do facilitate the kind of travel and trade that we want to continue to have. And we simply cannot go on allowing people to come in without knowing if we've made any mistakes. We know we've made some mistakes because like 30 to 40% of the people who are here resident as illegal aliens came in with a visa or through the visa waiver program. So that's 3 to 4 million mistakes, and we need to develop better information on who is not leaving.
And we've seen some pilots in the airports in terms of foreign nationals who are leaving and they're supposed to essentially sign out. Why hasn't that worked?
Well, I think it's because it's largely voluntary. In theory, if you don't check out through one of these kiosks, it makes it difficult to come back. But I think in practice, it hasn't really worked. But back to visa waivers, just for a
Just quickly,
second.
Steve, on that point, can I just to clarify, there is a proposed rule that was put in place in the Bush administration to require the airlines to record that information. They're very reluctant, the reason being that the airlines don't want to have to physically take fingerprints from people. A lot of boarding passes, you press the kiosk, you get your boarding pass. In terms of their systems, they think it would be very disruptive. But that's the proposal on the table right now, that the airlines will take this exit information.
And they're probably not interested in doing that. On visa waivers, prior to 9/11, we tried to talk to the Canadians about harmonizing our visa waiver lists because we have a 5,300-mile border with Canada. If you can get into Canada, if you want to get into the United States, you can, somewhere out in Montana or Idaho. The Canadians were not interested in discussing that with us. They said, we're not going to let the United States decide who gets into Canada. After 9/11, part of the Smart Border Action Plan was indeed that we did reach agreement on certain countries that were on the Canadian list that we thought were problematic. Some of the micro-states in the Pacific where you could essentially buy citizenship or buy a passport, they didn't seem like good bets. The Canadians took them off their list. On our list, we used to have a visa waiver program for Argentina, and that was of concern to Canada because the number one nationality applying for asylum at their border in New York was Argentinians who would fly to New York visa-free, go to the border and apply for asylum there. So after 9/11, we did manage to harmonize, not completely, our visa waiver list. And also, as Jessica and I learned in our consular training, a visa just gives you permission to apply for entry, and you still have to go through the screening process at the border. It probably is less intensive than being seen in an embassy, but there is some control there.
Please, more questions in the back. Pink shirt.
I believe that the 287G program is voluntary for the municipalities. And I also believe that there are not that many municipalities that have agreed to participate in the program. If that is the case, why are they reluctant to sign up for the program?
A lot of different reasons. Some political, some logistical, some because ICE can't meet the demand for it right now. There are about 60, I forget if it's 62 or 67 jurisdictions that have received the delegation of authority and training from ICE. And there are 950 state and local law enforcement officers who now have those authorities. There are still 42 jurisdictions on the waiting list, and there just simply isn't enough capacity at ICE to get them all done and trained and in place. And there are also some movements now underway to rewrite the rules to the program, which we're not exactly sure yet what those new rules are going to say, but I'm pretty confident that they're not going to be making it easier.
Another issue is resources. Under 287G, the municipality or the county pays for everything. The only thing they don't pay for is the 5-week training course, but they have to pay the salaries of their people while they're going through the course. There's no other money that comes with the program. So some municipalities look at that and say, no thanks. And then there's also been accusations of racial profiling attached to it. So it's opposed by a lot of immigration groups because if you look Hispanic, you may be pulled over on suspicion of, maybe be pulled over faster for speeding, at least that's the allegation, than if you don't look Hispanic, on the theory that you might also be in the country illegally. So like Wake County and Durham County aren't participating, but Johnson County to the north is.
I think actually, these are important, but I think we missed the big reason, and it's the reason that the big municipalities mostly are not participating. They see it as potentially competing with their primary law enforcement mission. They worry that, say to take an example, if you are an illegal immigrant and you are the victim of a crime, or witness to a crime. You're an illegal immigrant woman, you've been beaten, and you think, well, I should report this to the cops, or you've seen a crime. You're not going to do that because you're worried that they're going to check your immigration status and you have the potential for being deported. So they're worried that it's going to create suspicion, hostility in communities with large numbers of illegal immigrants and interfere with their more fundamental law enforcement mission, which is ensuring peace, security, combating serious crimes in those communities. And that's caused a lot of big cities to be reluctant to participate.
I'm sorry, I actually would have to disagree very strenuously with that based on the research that I've done. The reason major cities are not joining 287G is because they have ICE offices right there in these major cities. Most of the applicants of the program are in areas where there is not currently now a large ICE presence. So that was the original idea behind the program, was to provide a way to address the crime problems associated with illegal immigration in areas that were far from ICE. It's not because of this so-called chilling effect. It's simply a staffing issue. I mean, it's just a coverage thing.
Is the legislation that's being possibly proposed, is that to make it mandatory on the municipalities?
No, no.
More questions? Okay, on this side of the room, and then over here. That will probably be it.
Yes, thank you. Ms. Vaughan, I think you said that the E-Verify was a good way to check on illegal workers, but I understand that Congress took it out of the last stimulus bill for contractors working for the government, and I just wonder, how much Congress is involved. I know that this congressman is gone, so you can speak freely. How much Congress is involved? Because the H-1B visa, that's limited by Congress, I understand, and they don't sell out, but they are used up within the first 20 minutes that they're offered. So there's a number of things that Congress could do that they're not doing that sort of squeezes the amount of people coming in. When you mentioned 2,000 people a day lining up at the Mexico City, I worked there 4 years, and not in the embassy, but so I know those people. Now, why do they have to stand in line where the rest of the people who are here just walk across the border? I know sometimes it's difficult, but I'm just wondering why there's this double standard. If you walk across and you get in, you're fine, but if you stand in line for many times, because I knew people that used to stand in line for weeks, and they would be turned down eventually. So why this double standard? And how much could Congress do to solve a lot of these problems? Thank you.
I think there were two questions. Steve, why don't you take the second question first?
I'll take the
on
Mexican
border crossing
visa.
cards versus the visas.
The ones that sneak across the Sonoran Desert don't think they'd get a visa. In fact, they've been interviewed in detention centers in the Southwest, and most of them never applied. So they didn't apply first, get refused, and then sneak in. They just assumed they'd never get a visa. So the ones that we see in Mexico City, by the way, all 2,000 have to have an appointment. So it's not like queuing up early gets you in the door sooner. They all have appointments based on a certain time of day. Those are people who think that they actually can make a case that they meet the qualifications to get a visa and have the resources to pay for it. So it's not really a double standard. People are self-selecting and electing to cross the border illegally versus those who are queuing up and trying to get a visa.
Steve, isn't there, you said a lot of people just walk across, and I don't think you were referring to people who walked across illegally. I think you were talking about people who walked across with border crossing cards, which is different from a visa, because a border crossing card is, well, it is a visa, but it's a temporary. You are not allowed to stay. You can only stay for, what is it, 72 hours when you cross with a border crossing card?
Well, you're not allowed to travel a certain distance.
Past 75 miles past the border or something like that?
It varies by jurisdiction, I think, how far you can go. But no, I actually am talking about the ones who are crossing illegally.
Oh, okay.
Because a border crossing card is like a visa. You go through the same process, apply for one, the security checks are the same.
Okay.
It is a B1, B2 visa.
Do we have another question? Okay, last one for the day.
I'd like you to comment on risk management and how that would work bureaucratically. The example that I'll use is an air ambulance company. they want to fly. That's their business. They all know each other. They don't want to risk an accident. So risk management works because there's a process that works because the imperative to fly and the imperative to not die lie in the same person. So how would risk management work in the case that you propose, namely managing this issue?
Well, I think, what was attempted in some halting ways in DHS after its formation, and they're still, I think, working towards it, is a kind of systematic analysis of costs and benefits of different sorts of strategies. So, for instance, and I wish Bob Lycan were on the panel. I mean, he's done a very good job of looking at, where are the countries where we have seen most of the terrorists coming to the United States here, where do they emanate from? And so, what are the biggest threats in terms of trying to keep terrorists out of the United States? And focusing on those threats. What are the different tools you can use, and what are the costs in terms of legitimate travel? So how big is the risk, and how high are the costs for trying to shut down a particular vulnerability? And we haven't done a lot of thinking about that. I think we're mostly moving through kind of a list of vulnerabilities, because there are a lot of different ways of getting into the United States, and you close one and the next one looms larger, because if you're a smart terrorist, well, if one door is closed, you're going to try to go through another. And I think we haven't thought enough about how do we target effectively so that our protection is raised at the least cost to these other elements of security that David talked about at the outset and that I talked about. So it's more a way of thinking. I mean, you might even call it cost-benefit analysis, I suppose, but I hesitate to use that term just because it sort of implies a certain kind of economic analysis. But I think, we have stumbled towards this, and there are a lot of people in DHS who believe in this approach. I think Stuart Baker believes in this approach. But I think to a considerable extent it gets outweighed by just the imperative to keep tightening the border, to find the next vulnerability and shut it down.
I just spent 2 days in Washington on a conference on on risk management and homeland security. It's in short, it's a great ideal and it's a great concept. In practice, it's very, very difficult. The threat is uncertain. The efficacy of our protective measures is incredibly difficult to measure. It's very difficult to measure something that didn't happen. And then the enormity of the resources and vulnerabilities when you're looking at trying to do economic analysis on the wide variety of resources that could potentially be attacked in the United States. So while we can all get up and say that DHS is a risk management agency and we should prioritize our spending and allocate our resources to where we'll get the best counterterrorism bang for the buck, everybody can stand up and say that. Then when you ask somebody, okay, how are we going to do that? You can get the smartest people in the world in a room, and you're going to have a very hard problem. So it's a great concept, but it's a tough nut to crack.
Well, on that note, David, I'm going to ask the audience to join me in thanking you. A few words regarding what's coming. For those of you that have signed up to join us for dinner tonight, Ambassador Hussein Hassouna will be giving us his thoughts on what the Arab community expects of the Obama administration. So if we haven't heard it before, we will hear the other view tonight. That will be in the dining room area of the Thomas Center. Cocktails, hosted cocktails at 6:30, dinner at 7. For those who are not joining us, we will reconvene here, continental breakfast at 8 o'clock. I'll be kicking off the panel at 8:45 on detention and prosecution of terrorists, trying to find a new paradigm, to be followed by Bruce Chenelson's panel. How does the United States reintegrate itself into the international community? And then lunch, Stuart Baker, he's already been mentioned. Steve mentioned him, and Ted did. He will be our luncheon speaker, the former Assistant Secretary for Policy of Homeland Security. And then tomorrow afternoon, we'll have our final panel, revisiting the United States objections to the International Criminal Court. And that's going to be something, I think. So we will see you either tonight or tomorrow. Thank you for coming today.